They say a long marriage is like a fine wine, it gets better with age. But after 50 years, I've learned that even the finest bottle can develop cracks if you don't handle it carefully. My name is Arthur, and for half a century, I thought I knew everything about my wife, Linda. We married young, built our lives together, and weathered every storm life threw our way. Or so I believed. Linda and I first met in 1975 at a county fair in Georgia. She was the kind of woman who could light up a room just by walking into it. I was just a farm boy then, working odd jobs to save up for trade school. We didn't have much, but we made it work. Together, we raised 2 children, built a successful family business, and retired in the same small town where it all began. I always thought we were the picture of stability. Our days were filled with routine, a morning coffee on the porch, crossword puzzles in the local paper, and weekend dinners with our kids and grandkids. It was the kind of life most people would envy. But things started to shift a few months ago. Linda, who had always been predictable, started acting differently. She began taking yoga classes, something she had never expressed interest in before. She'd return home late, claiming the sessions ran over or that she'd stayed to chat with her new friends. "Yoga helps me feel alive," she told me one evening when I asked about her sudden enthusiasm. At first, I didn't think much of it. We were both retired, why shouldn't she have a new hobby? But then I noticed other things. Her phone, which had always been an afterthought to her, became a constant companion. She'd smile at it, sometimes laugh softly, and then quickly set it aside whenever I entered the room. One evening, she mentioned a girls' trip to Savannah, something she'd never done in all our years together. It felt off, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. After all, 50 years of marriage builds trust, or at least it should. But then, last week, I found her car parked at the far end of the grocery store lot when she was supposed to be at yoga. She didn't see me, but I saw her. She was sitting in the driver's seat, talking animatedly on her phone, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. She looked younger, almost as if she'd discovered a part of herself that had been locked away. I told myself it wasn't my place to question her happiness. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, and not for the better. A week after seeing Linda in the grocery store parking lot, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. Her smile, the way she leaned into the phone like it was the most captivating conversation she'd ever had, it wasn't something you'd forget after 50 years of marriage. That night, as we sat down for dinner, I decided to test the waters. "How was yoga today?" I asked casually, slicing into the meatloaf she'd prepared. She barely looked up. "Good," she replied, too quickly. We had a new instructor. It was more intense than usual. "Must have been, if it ran so late," I said, keeping my voice steady. She froze for a fraction of a second before brushing it off with a forced laugh. "Oh, you know how chatty everyone gets afterward." I didn't realize it was that late. I nodded, not wanting to push too hard just yet. But in my gut, I knew she was lying. The next morning, I took action. Linda had always been the less tech-savvy one in our relationship, and for years, I'd managed most of our shared accounts. She didn't know that I still had access to our phone records. Logging in wasn't hard, and it didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There it was, a single number repeated over and over again. Calls in the middle of the day, late at night, even during the hours she was supposed to be at yoga. I wrote it down and stared at it for a long moment. Who could it be? A friend? A distant relative? The voice in my head told me otherwise, but I wasn't ready to admit it. That evening, I decided to press her a little more. As we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I asked, "Do you remember the Hendersons? They split up a few years back because of, well, you know." Linda glanced at me, her expression guarded. "Yes, I remember." "What about them?" "Just thinking how you can never really know someone, even after years together," I said, watching her carefully. She didn't respond, but I noticed her grip tighten on the armrest of her chair. 2 days later, I took a bolder step. I called the number. My hands didn't shake, and my voice was calm, but my chest felt like it was lined with lead as the phone rang. "Hello," a man's voice answered. I didn't recognize it, but I played dumb. "Hi, this is Arthur. I think I might have misdialed. Sorry for the trouble." "No problem," the man said before hanging up. It wasn't much, but hearing his voice made it real. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just a random name in her contact list. I wasn't sure what I'd do next, but one thing was clear: I needed answers, and I wasn't going to stop until I had them. I couldn't stop thinking about the man's voice on the other end of the line. Calm, polite, and completely unfamiliar. Who was he? And more importantly, why was Linda calling him so often? My gut told me this wasn't just a friend or someone from her yoga class. No, this was something else entirely. That night, as Linda slept soundly beside me, I knew it was time to dig deeper. I quietly got out of bed, careful not to wake her, and went into my study. Her phone was charging on the kitchen counter, just as it always was. I hesitated for a moment. Snooping felt wrong, it went against everything I believed in. But after 50 years of marriage, I couldn't ignore the growing evidence. I needed to know the truth. The phone was locked, but her passcode wasn't exactly a state secret. Linda had always used my birthday for everything, a fact that now felt ironic. I unlocked it and opened her messages. It didn't take long to find him. His name was Greg, and the text thread was at the top of the list. My stomach tightened as I read through their conversation. At first, it seemed innocent enough: talks about yoga, shared jokes, and compliments about her baking. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. "I loved seeing you today. You looked beautiful as always," one message read. "I can't stop thinking about our last time together," said another. And then, the final blow, a photo of Linda, taken in what I recognized as the parking lot of the grocery store. She was smiling, leaning against her car, wearing the same outfit I'd seen her in that day. I sat back in my chair, the phone still in my hand, and tried to process what I'd just seen. This wasn't just a flirtation. This was an affair. The next day, I called my friend Bill, a retired police officer. Bill had always been the kind of guy who knew how to get things done. I didn't give him all the details, but I told him enough. "Bill, I need some help. Can you look into someone for me?" He didn't ask many questions, just a name and a number. "Give me a couple of days," he said. In the meantime, I kept my composure. I didn't let on that I knew anything, though every time Linda smiled at me or mentioned yoga, it felt like a dagger twisting deeper. 3 days later, Bill called me back. "You're not gonna like what I found," he said grimly. Greg wasn't just some random guy from yoga. He was a widower, living a few towns over, and had a reputation. "He's been involved with a few married women," Bill explained. "Looks like he has a type." As Bill spoke, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Linda wasn't his first affair, and unless I did something about it, she wouldn't be his last. It was no longer just about my marriage. This man was preying on vulnerable women, and I wasn't going to let him continue. Once I knew the truth about Greg, my anger turned into something sharper: purpose. I wasn't going to let him or Linda walk away from this unscathed. 50 years of marriage didn't deserve to end with a whimper. No, this betrayal called for action, and I was going to make sure they both felt the consequences. That evening, I sat in my study, making a list of everything I needed to do. First, I had to protect myself. Linda and I had shared everything: our accounts, a home, a life. If this went to court, I wasn't about to let her walk away with half of what we'd built together while she was sneaking around with Greg. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Paul, a man I hadn't spoken to in years but whose reputation as a pit bull in divorce cases preceded him. "Paul," I said, "I need to start preparing for a divorce, and I need to do it quietly." He didn't ask too many questions. He'd been in this business long enough to know what that meant. "Freeze your joint accounts immediately," he advised. "Move half the funds to a separate account in your name only. Document everything, texts, emails, photos. The more evidence you have, the better position you'll be in." I spent the next 2 days gathering everything I could. Every text message, every phone record, even the photo of Linda leaning against her car. By the time I was done, I had enough to paint a very clear picture of her infidelity. But that wasn't enough for me. I didn't just want a clean divorce. I wanted them both to feel the weight of what they'd done. So, I decided to take things a step further. I hired a private investigator to follow Linda. It was an expense I didn't take lightly, but I knew it was the only way to get concrete proof of her affair. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen, was thorough. Within a week, she had photos of Linda and Greg together, at a cafe, walking hand in hand at a park, even entering a motel. When Karen handed me the file, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. There it was, undeniable proof of everything I'd been suspecting. But the sadness didn't last long. I had a plan, and I wasn't about to back down now. The first step was to confront Linda, but not in private. No, that would be too easy for her. Instead, I decided to wait for the perfect moment, a family dinner we'd planned with our sons and their families. As the day approached, I prepared everything. The photos, the texts, and even a few key pieces of information about Greg that Bill had dug up. He had a history of preying on married women, and I wasn't going to let my family think this was just some innocent mistake on Linda's part. On the night of the dinner, I sat at the head of the table, watching as Linda laughed with our grandchildren and passed the mashed potatoes as if nothing was wrong. She had no idea what was coming. The night of the family dinner was here, and I felt ready for what was about to unfold. I had spent days going over the plan in my head, fine-tuning every detail. This wasn't just about confronting Linda. It was about reclaiming my dignity, showing my sons the truth, and making sure Greg's dirty little game was exposed for what it was. The table was set, the food was ready, and the house buzzed with laughter and conversation. Richard and Mark, our sons, were catching up, swapping stories about work and their kids. Linda played the perfect hostess, smiling and making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink. She looked so natural, so comfortable, as if she hadn't been living a double life for months. I waited until the plates were cleared and everyone had moved into the living room for coffee and dessert. That's when I made my move. "Linda," I said, standing up from my chair. "I think it's time we talked about something important." She looked at me, puzzled, but kept her composure. "Of course, Arthur. What's on your mind?" I glanced around the room at our sons, their wives, and even our grandchildren, who were too young to understand what was about to happen. "It's about our marriage," I continued. "And some truths that have come to light recently." Her smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and apprehension. I reached for the manila folder I'd tucked under the coffee table earlier that day and placed it on the table in front of me. "This," I said, tapping the folder, "is a collection of everything I've discovered over the past few weeks. Photos, messages, phone records. All the proof I need." Linda's face went pale. "Arthur, what is this?" "This," I said, my voice steady, "is the evidence of your affair with Greg." The room fell silent. Richard and Mark looked at each other in confusion, their wives whispering quietly, unsure of how to react. Linda stammered, "You've got it all wrong. I don't know what you're talking about." I didn't flinch. "Really? Then maybe you'd like to explain why I have photos of you holding hands with him at the park. Or why he called you beautiful in dozens of texts." Or better yet, why there are pictures of you both entering a motel together. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in years, Linda was at a loss for words. "Dad, what's going on?" Richard asked, his tone firm. "What's going on," I said, turning to my sons, "is that your mother has been lying to all of us. For months, she's been sneaking around with this man. A man who, by the way, has a history of preying on married women." Linda finally found her voice. "Arthur, please, let's not do this here. Not in front of the kids." I shook my head. "You didn't seem to care about the kids when you were meeting him behind my back. You didn't care about our family when you decided to throw away 50 years of marriage. So no, Linda, we are doing this here. Everyone deserves to know the truth." Richard stood up, anger flashing in his eyes. "Is this true, Mom? Tell me it's not true." She didn't answer. Instead, tears welled up in her eyes as she turned away, unable to face any of us. "Unbelievable," Mark muttered, shaking his head in disgust. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. This isn't just about me or your mother. It's about all of us. This family deserves honesty, and I won't let her lies tear us apart. The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Linda stood up and walked out of the room, leaving everyone else behind to process what had just happened. The silence left behind after Linda walked out was suffocating. For the first time in our family's history, the woman who held us together was now the reason we were crumbling. But I wasn't done. The truth had to be fully exposed, not just for me, but for my sons, their families, and even for Linda herself. After a few moments, Richard broke the silence. "Dad, what's next? Are you going to let her just walk out like that?" I shook my head. "No. I've waited too long for this moment. She made her choices, and now she's going to face the consequences." I stood up, grabbed the folder with the evidence, and motioned for Richard and Mark to follow me. "I need you to see something. Both of you." We sat down at the dining table, away from the grandchildren, and I began laying out the contents of the folder. Their faces shifted from confusion to anger as they saw the photos of Linda and Greg together, holding hands, laughing at a cafe, and walking into a motel. The text messages I'd printed out left no room for doubt. "She's been seeing him for months," I explained. "And he's not just some innocent guy. He's done this before, multiple times, with other women." Mark clenched his fists. "How could she do this? After all these years?" Richard stared at the photos, his jaw tight. "What about him? This Greg guy. Does he know you know?" "Not yet," I said. "But he will." The following morning, I decided to take my next step. Greg wasn't going to get away with this. It wasn't just about my marriage anymore, it was about exposing him for what he truly was. I wanted to make sure his reputation was shattered, and I knew just how to do it. Greg worked as a financial advisor for a small but well-known firm in a nearby town. Bill had already provided me with the details. With a few phone calls, I confirmed that Greg's firm prided itself on its family-first values, a reputation that I was about to dismantle. That afternoon, I arrived at Greg's office. I walked in confidently, holding the folder of evidence, and requested to see him. The receptionist hesitated, but when I mentioned I had information that would impact the firm's reputation, she quickly made the call. A few minutes later, Greg appeared, looking every bit the polished professional. He extended his hand with a forced smile. "Mr. Bennett, what can I do for you?" I didn't shake his hand. Instead, I placed the folder on the table between us. "You can start by explaining why you've been sleeping with my wife." His face went pale as he glanced at the folder, realizing exactly what it contained. "Look, I don't know what you think you know, but..." I cut him off. "What I know is that you've been preying on married women for years. And now, it's time for everyone else to know it too. Greg tried to regain his composure, but the panic in his eyes betrayed him. What do you want? Money? To keep this quiet? I leaned in, my voice calm but firm. I don't want your money. I want you out of my life, out of my wife's life, and out of this town. Because if you don't disappear, I'll make sure every one of your clients sees this file. Greg's confidence crumbled, and for the first time, I saw fear in the man who thought he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. Greg sat there frozen, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of my words. He glanced around nervously, as if the walls themselves might close in and expose him further. I let the silence stretch, watching him squirm. This wasn't just about my marriage anymore, it was about making sure he couldn't keep doing this to other families. I don't know what you're hoping to achieve here, Greg finally muttered, trying to regain his composure. This won't help you. I leaned back in my chair, smirking. Oh, Greg, I'm not the one who needs help. You are. He didn't respond, so I opened the folder and slid a photo across the table. It was one Karen had taken of him and Linda, walking arm in arm at the park. His face went pale. You see, I continued, I've got everything I need right here. Photos, texts, timestamps, all of it. And let me tell you, it paints a pretty damning picture of you as a serial homewrecker. Greg's confidence was eroding fast. What do you want? He asked, his voice quieter now. I want you gone. Out of my wife's life, out of this town, and out of your little bubble of privilege. Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone in your professional circle sees this. I gestured to the folder. Your clients, your boss, your neighbors, I'll show them all the real Greg. You can't be serious, he said, his voice shaking. Oh, I'm dead serious, I replied. Do you think your clients will trust a financial advisor who preys on married women? Do you think your firm will keep someone whose private life is a PR nightmare? Greg opened his mouth to argue but quickly shut it again. He knew I was right. After a long pause, he finally nodded. Fine. I'll leave her alone. That's not good enough, I said, my voice firm. You'll cut all ties with Linda immediately. No calls, no texts, no accidental run-ins. If I so much as hear your name again, this folder goes public. Do you understand me? He swallowed hard and nodded. Yes. I understand. But I wasn't done yet. One more thing, I added. You going to send her a message right now, ending things. And I'm going to watch you do it. Greg looked at me, stunned. You kidding? Do I look like I'm kidding? I said coldly. Reluctantly, he pulled out his phone and typed out the message while I stood over his shoulder. It was short, direct, and left no room for interpretation. Linda, this has to stop. Don't contact me again. When he showed me the message, I nodded. Now send it. He pressed send, and just like that, the first piece of my plan was complete. Greg was out of the picture, or so it seemed. But I knew better than to think it would be that easy. Men like him are cowards by nature, but they're also manipulative. There was always the risk that he'd try to worm his way back into Linda's life or retaliate against me for backing him into a corner. That's why I wasn't done yet. The first step was making sure Linda knew I was in control now. When I got home that evening, I found her sitting in the living room, her face pale and her expression a mix of guilt and defiance. She must have seen Greg's message by now. Arthur, she began, but I raised my hand to stop her. Don't, I said firmly. I've heard enough of your lies. Now you're going to listen. She fell silent, and for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. I met with Greg today, I continued. And let me be clear, he's done. Out of your life, out of this town, and hopefully out of anyone else's life he could destroy. But that's not where this ends. Her lip quivered as she tried to speak. Arthur, I said. Don't, I interrupted. 50 years, Linda. 50 years of trust, loyalty, and sacrifices. And you threw it away for what? For some guy who preys on vulnerable women? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. You don't get to cry, Linda. Not after what you've done. I sat down across from her, my tone cold and deliberate. Here's what's going to happen. First, we're separating. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and the divorce papers are being drafted as we speak. Second, you'll leave this house by the end of the week. This is my home, the one we built together, and you forfeited your right to it the moment you betrayed me. She gasped. Arthur, please, we can work this out. I made a mistake. Mistake? I said, my voice rising. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner. What you did was a calculated betrayal. Don't insult my intelligence by calling it a mistake. She sobbed openly now, but I remained unmoved. Third, I continued, our sons already know everything. I made sure of that. They know who you really are, Linda. And they are as disgusted as I am. Her head dropped, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But she didn't. She just sat there, broken, realizing she had lost everything. Pack your things, I said, standing up. And don't think for a second that you'll walk away with anything more than you deserve. I've frozen the accounts, transferred my share, and documented everything. You can take what's yours, but not a penny more. I walked away without waiting for a response, leaving her sitting there in silence. For the first time in this entire mess, I felt like I was in control. The days after Linda moved out were eerily quiet. For 50 years, the house had been filled with the familiar rhythm of our life together. Now, it was just me and the echoes of everything I thought we'd built. But instead of mourning, I was focused on finishing what I'd started. I wasn't just going to let Linda and Greg fade into the background. They had caused too much damage to me, to our family, and to the trust that I had spent decades giving so freely. It was time to expose them both, and I knew exactly where to start. The first thing I did was send copies of Greg's texts and photos to his firm's HR department. I crafted a professional yet damning email that outlined his behavior and attached all the evidence Karen had gathered. Greg's company, which prided itself on its family-first values, couldn't afford the PR nightmare that would follow if they ignored this. It didn't take long to see the results. By the end of the week, I heard through Bill that Greg had been called into a meeting with his superiors. Shortly after, he was encouraged to resign. His career was in shambles, and his carefully curated image of the respectable financial advisor was gone. But that wasn't enough. Greg might have been dealt with, but Linda still hadn't faced the full weight of what she'd done. I knew she was staying at her sister's house, so I decided to visit her there, not to argue or plead, but to deliver one final blow. When I arrived, Linda looked more defeated than I'd ever seen her. She opened the door reluctantly, her eyes red and puffy. Arthur, I don't think this is a good time, she said quietly. I ignored her protest and stepped inside. We need to talk, I said firmly. And it won't take long. Her sister, Karen, stood in the hallway, her arms crossed. She didn't look surprised to see me, she probably already knew everything. I nodded at her before turning back to Linda. I just wanted you to know what's next, I said, pulling a document out of my bag. This is the finalized divorce agreement. You'll see that you're getting exactly what you're entitled to, nothing more, nothing less. And in case you're thinking about contesting it, remember that I have every piece of evidence I need to show a judge. Linda's lip trembled, but I wasn't done. There's one more thing. I've already spoken to the boys. They're taking my side in this, Linda. They understand what you've done, and they won't tolerate any attempts to paint yourself as the victim. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. Arthur, please, she whispered. I've lost everything. Isn't that enough? I stared at her, feeling no pity. You didn't think about what you were losing when you decided to betray me. So no, Linda, it's not enough. You'll live with this for the rest of your life, and that's exactly what you deserve. As I left the house, Karen followed me to the door. She didn't say much, but as I stepped outside, she muttered, "She brought this on herself." I walked away knowing that the life I had with Linda was over. And while I wasn't celebrating, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, and I had finally taken my life back. After handing Linda the divorce papers and seeing her defeated, I thought I'd feel relief, maybe even satisfaction. But there was still one final thread to pull, one last piece to tie up. Greg might have lost his job and Linda might have been out of my life, but I wasn't ready to let them walk away without truly understanding the consequences of their actions. The morning after my confrontation with Linda, I made one last call to Bill. I want to make sure Greg can't just rebuild somewhere else, I told him. Bill laughed on the other end. You want me to bury the guy? Not literally, I replied, smirking. But I want him exposed to anyone who might cross his path. Over the next few days, Bill and I worked together to compile every piece of dirt we could find on Greg. He had a trail of destruction spanning years, affairs with married women, shady business dealings, and even a string of clients who had accused him of unethical financial practices. Then, with Bill's help, I leaked it all. Social media, local blogs, even a well-timed tip to a small-town journalist who was hungry for a scandal. Within days, Greg's name was plastered across the internet. His carefully curated life of respectability was in shreds. But I wasn't done with Linda either. I knew she'd try to spin her story, play the victim to anyone who'd listen. So I decided to deliver a message she couldn't ignore. On the day she came to collect her things from the house, I left a letter on the kitchen table. It was short, brutal, and to the point. Linda. For 50 years, I believed in us. I trusted you. I loved you. And you repaid me with lies, betrayal, and humiliation. You didn't just hurt me, you hurt our family, our sons, and everything we built together. You will live the rest of your life knowing that you destroyed everything we had. And if you think there's any hope of rebuilding what's left, let me be clear, you've burned that bridge to ashes. This house is no longer your home. This family is no longer your safety net. You are on your own now, as you should be. Arthur. When I returned home later that day, the house was empty. She'd taken her clothes, her personal belongings, and nothing more. The letter was gone, but I didn't care. It wasn't for me, it was for her, a reminder of the life she threw away. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild. I focused on myself, my hobbies, and my relationship with my sons. They stood by me through it all, offering their support and even encouraging me to start fresh. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey, I felt something I hadn't in months, a peace. Greg was gone, Linda was out of my life, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my future. This wasn't the life I had envisioned when I said my vows 50 years ago, but it was mine now. And that was enough.